And we want to welcome everyone back for our first session, Leveraging Climate and Leadership for Positive Cultural Change. I am again Joe Storch from the State University of New York, and we are in for an exceptional panel with our speakers. I did receive a question. If you wish to turn on closed caption, that is in the CC live transcript button that you will see in the Zoom panel. So you can turn on transcript. We have a professional captioner here with us. We invite you to turn your cameras on to again make this feel like more of a conversation with our speakers and our leaders. And I'm so pleased to turn things over to one of SUNY's presidents who had a distinguished military career prior to joining us as the 5th president of Finger Lakes Community College. Dr. Robert Nye is the president of Finger Lakes. He also served as the vice president for academic affairs at Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology in Lancaster and deputy provost of the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He is going to introduce our panel, and we are going to have a great conversation. His and all of our speakers' full bios are available in the documents that are on the web. So without further ado, Dr. Nye, President Nye, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it, and welcome to everyone. Today, our goal is to explore and expand the importance of climate leadership in preventing sexual assault, sexual harassment in academic, organizational, and military settings. And while these organizations may be different, we all share a common task for ensuring the welfare and success of all of our students and all of our military personnel. The past 4 decades have seen progress in understanding of the character of sexual assault and sexual harassment, including its nature, causes, consequences, and context. There's a growing awareness of the need to not only provide response resources and protections to victims, but also to intervene and prevent these incidences. The shift to an increased focus on prevention is critical. It's one of the goals for this session in setting the foundation for how we advance and think about and approach prevention. Most prevention efforts have focused on individuals, from promoting bystanders to supporting victims to better recognizing the characteristics of those who engage in negative behaviors. These are critical areas, but the context and environment around individuals are equally important. What are the team, leader, and organizational factors that shape both negative and positive behaviors? What are the skills and capabilities we need to shape the environment to prevent negative experiences and create healthy and safe environments? In this effort, we've asked our panel of distinguished guests to help us answer the questions of what is next from an organizational and leadership perspective for preventing sexual assault and sexual harassment in diverse settings. And it is my honor to introduce to you first Dr. Jessica Gallus from the Department of Navy and Marine Corps, who is a senior advisor on sexual assault, sexual harassment, and suicide. She provides strategic guidance on violence prevention, response policy, programs, training, and development for a workforce of over 1 million personnel. Her research and leadership experiences have focused on the organizational factors that contribute to negative work behaviors and the social aspects of performance, such as trust, resilience, and professionalism that are needed for high performance. Next, we have Dr. Sean Hanna, who is an experienced leader, senior leader, scholar, and leader development expert. Prior to his appointment to the Wilson Chair at Wake Forest University, he served 26 years in the U.S. Army and was the founding director of the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic. He was present in the Pentagon on 9/11, where he helped lead the reconstitution of the organization that sustained the highest casualty level in the attack and to rebuild that team, which was a multi-billion-dollar operation. He's been recognized by the Academy of Management for his tremendous contributions to research and practice on leadership, management, and character. Next, we have Dr. Vicki Magley, who is a psychology professor at the University of Connecticut and a subject matter expert on workplace sexual harassment, incivility, and the climates of mistreatment. She has advised a broad range of agencies on creating healthier climates, including institutions of higher education, the World Bank Group, the Armed Services, and a number of federal agencies. Most recently, she provided her expertise to the 2018 National Academies of Sciences consensus study on sexual harassment in academia and chaired a follow-up workshop on intervention evaluation in April of 2021. And finally, our discussant today is Dr. Amy Levi, the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, the Albers Endowed Professor of Midwifery at the University of New Mexico College of Nursing, and the Director of the Office of Interprofessional Education at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. Prior to joining University of New Mexico, she was a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, the University of Vermont School of Medicine, and the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, And now, Dr. Gallus, please take it away to talk to us about health relationships at work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nye, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to talk with such a diverse audience today. And as Dr. Nye said, I'll be going over healthy relationships at work. Why healthy relationships? So some of you who signed up for this panel may think, hey, I signed up to hear about sexual harassment, sexual assault, and I assure you that this is a strategic and deliberate focus on our part. So yesterday, a number of our panelists highlighted that it's important to move beyond risk reduction and set the conditions so negative behaviors don't happen. And I think of healthy relationships as a critical piece of primary prevention. So it's recognizing incivility, sexual harassment, and other negative behaviors as risk factors for sexual assault. And then really equipping our team members and leaders with the skills they need to create healthy climates that reduce the likelihood of these things happening. Just to give you some context for my talk, you'll notice in a few slides that I'll be talking about a military-focused project, but I think the lessons here apply to college and university students, those in trade schools, and really anyone in the workplace. So when I talk about the fact that the DoD has thousands of new recruits each year, I imagine that many of you on this webinar can relate to getting thousands of new students each year from all walks of life with different beliefs, values, experiences, and the opportunities that those experiences bring. Before I get into the meat of the talk, I really just want to quickly acknowledge a handful of our partners. This was undoubtedly a team effort. So first, to thank OpNav M17, particularly Dr. Stollard and Clinton Sherrod for their support, Dr. Stollard for his heavy lifting, our partners in Navy Education and Training Command, our incredible partners at Marine Corps Training Command, Mike Hepburn, Justin Kinner, Anthony Zerwinski, who know training like no one else, and Dr. Jagger and Lindsay Reed at Marine and Family Programs for their incredible contributions. And finally, I just want to thank our service partners, the many researchers we talked with, the individuals from Army Resilience, Air Force Resilience, and also those at the Army Training Center in Fort Jackson, particularly Colonel Frambies. So why healthy relationships? Before I get into the why, I just want to give you a quick recap of what we mean when we talk about healthy relationships. So these are the relationships that are personal or professional. They include appropriate boundaries, and really the impacts are beneficial to physical, mental, or emotional health. At least this is the way that the Department of Defense defines them. So this broad concept of personal and professional domains. Personal could be family, community, romantic, and then of course, professional, peers, coworkers, followers, etc. And why do these matter? At the most basic level, in the DoD, we have tens of thousands of new service members entering the service each year. Many come with values and beliefs that are different from those we expect of service members. Some have not had positive relationships previously, whether these are personal or professional. And lastly, healthy relationship skills really support military readiness. So they're related to our performance, and we know that they reduce risk for sexual assault and other negative behaviors. From a broader perspective, one of the reasons that this area is so critical is because healthy relationship skills get at some of those protective factors that our speakers yesterday discussed. In other words, it's really not enough to focus on, have we stopped sexual harassment? Have we stopped sexual assault? That doesn't necessarily mean we've got a healthy climate. So we've also got to look at, how do we set the conditions? How do we give people the skills so that they can either contribute to or foster a healthy climate so that these behaviors don't happen? And to give you a little bit of background on this current project, the Secretary of the Navy had requested that Don SAPRO lead the services in reviewing recruit training to identify any gaps in healthy relationships and to include a very explicit focus on healthy relationships. And so as background, we did a number of things to really look into, well, what are the critical elements that people need for healthy relationship skills that we should include in healthy relationships training? In terms of our methodology, we conducted a scan of the traditional healthy relationships research. So a lot of that is in the partner and romantic domain. And then we also met with our sister service research partners, our training command partners, and talked with some of those leading recruit efforts for the other services. And we found a few interesting patterns. First, most of the healthy relationships research was focused on the personal domain and the individual skills and outcomes needed. And this is no doubt critical in terms of boundary setting, communications, those other skills that you really need to be effective in your personal life, maybe with your partner, with a friend. But we didn't see as much of in the traditional healthy relationships research that we did find in much of the existing accessions training and occupational health and organizational behavior literature was more of a focus on the environment. So there was more of this explicit focus on the context for negative behaviors and the team and leader influences on shaping behaviors. There was also a greater focus on performance outcomes. So beyond the individual, what are the impacts to the team? What are the impacts to the organization? And the takeaway for us is that there was a good amount of crossover between the skills you need in both the personal and professional domains, that the personal domain was more often highlighted, and that there were areas where we really realized we needed to expand our focus on team and leader context, given how salient these aspects are in military culture. So what did we find? We found that there are a broad set of skills needed for effective personal and professional relationships. And many of these are in concert with what we know from the healthy relationships research. And then we also saw that there were some additional aspects related to teams and psychological safety that we needed to consider. And, as scientists, we were all very excited to come up with these different domains. We took this information and gave it to our training partners. And fortunately, they are just whizzes at being able to distill some of these concepts into a framework that will make sense for service members and new recruits. And so in talking through what that framework would be, we really found that there were 3 key areas and 6 key elements. And the 3 key areas were around values, processes, and beliefs. And the 6 key elements are around respect, honesty, psychological safety, belongingness. So some of those team aspects of, I'm not just being included in meetings, but I really have a seat at the table and a say in what happens. And then finally, communication and teamwork, which you could see the linkages with that personal domain of healthy relationships with the additional focus on teams. And so we were excited to have this broad framework with the Marine Corps and Navy training commands. And in terms of next steps, and I'm sure it seems like I'm flying by, we all have a kind of a short window here to go through these, but we can certainly touch on anything in questions. So the updates that were made to recruit training curricula have been implemented. And some of our next steps include evaluation and also an expansion to other training and education environments. So the recognition that one size does not fit all, even if you have the same set of skills or competencies, the behaviors involved in executing those skills will look different. So if you think about the behaviors that maybe a team member would need in terms of communication, it might be, having respectful communications with other team members, whereas a leader, it may be about fostering an environment where those respectful communications happen. Some of the other areas that we're thinking about are how to make changes to the way we execute this training. And so recognizing some of the time limitations, what can we do to really build in prevention best practices, adult learning best practices around small group discussion, moving away from compliance-based approaches to approaches that really appeal to Marine and sailor values. And I think that's something that the services are already inherently skilled at. When we looked at the curricula that was in place, so much is focused on core values, the impact to the team. And I think that's in a lot of ways some of the framing that needs to happen to ensure that we reduce some of the common backlash around these issues and that training fatigue that we sometimes see. So in terms of key takeaways from this work, healthy relationships are critical, whether you're talking about the professional or personal domain. They're critical to primary prevention. If we want to really get after sexual harassment and sexual assault, we need to think about some of the basics of respect that Dr. Porath discussed. Our work also showed that there's really a benefit to cross-disciplinary approaches. So because teams are such a salient component of military culture, it may be more appropriate to leverage some of the teams and leadership research that's out there. And this may or may not be as relevant to other organizations. Really just depends on the culture of your organization and the mission. And finally, the importance of focusing on what right looks like as a way to reduce some of that backlash. We know based on sexual harassment literature that, sometimes folks who are most likely to perpetrate, if they receive training that is not done appropriately, that can just solidify their beliefs, their gender hostility. And so this idea that, not only do we have to help people reduce and help recognize some of these negative behaviors, but we also have to equip leaders and team members with the skills to build healthy climates. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
This is Dr. Sean Hand. I guess I'll just jump right in. I thought I was going to be handed over, but let me just get started here. I'd like to thank Dr. Gallus and the Department of Navy for inviting me to be part of this session today. Let me first talk a little bit about truth in lending up front. I am not a scholar of sexual harassment or assault. I am a scholar of leadership, and that's my area of specialty. But before you change the channel, the proposition I'm going to make to you today is that I think one of the best ways to move this entire conversation forward, and frankly, the conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and many other topics, is to think about it in a broader context of leadership and how leaders influence the culture of their organizations. If we think about the core roles and responsibilities of leaders, it's to provide a safe environment, to provide an inclusive environment, to provide an environment where everybody can thrive and be authentic and bring their true self to work and to really deliver at their most optimum potential. And that's a lot what Dr. Gallus was just talking about, creating that environment of positivity in the organizations. And if we think about that broader, I think we can accomplish a lot of things all at the same time. So I'm just going to briefly, in my few minutes with you today, talk about the influence of leaders on culture. And culture is an amorphous word. It gets thrown around a lot, and it's really difficult sometimes to get your head around what it truly is. And so I'm just going to quickly decompose it because I think it might be illustrative to some of the conversations today. The work of Edgar Schein is one of he is the top, I would say, organizational culture expert. He talks about culture as being an iceberg with these three different layers, that at the bottom of the iceberg are these underlying assumptions, these things that we have all just learned in the organization to be truths. And over time, we just don't even talk about them anymore. We just assume them to be true. And then from those underlying assumptions that we make about our organization, about the world we operate in, et cetera, then we turn and generate certain beliefs and certain things that we value and hold important because of that underlying assumptions of how the world works and should work and what makes us as an organization great. And then all that gets manifested at the artifact level. That's the stuff that's above the water, right? That's what's usually called climate, to be honest with you, is really the manifestations of culture. Things you can hear, see, touch, feel. The acts of sexual harassment and sexual assault are in themselves artifacts. The policies we make about them are artifacts. The offices that we create to oversee these types of efforts are artifacts of the organization. So just to give you a kind of an example, and I'll use the United States Army where I came from, deep down is an underlying assumption that doesn't even get talked about in the force because we all just assume it to be true. We don't need to talk about it, that soldiers need to be tough and physically fit so that they can handle the arduous conditions of battle. Well, from those assumptions, then, we begin to value physical fitness. We begin to value toughness. We begin to value masculinity. And then all of that gets seen at the artifact level. You go on an Army post and you see soldiers running around doing PT. We have awards and badges for physical training. And you see other manifestations of those things that we value and believe. Well, that's, again, because we have these underlying assumptions. Now, if you think about that, we have to then do an audit of our culture if we're going to address these issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault. We really need to go down deep underneath the waterline and not address it at that surface level, but go deep and say, what are those assumptions that we hold to be true in this organization that maybe we need to challenge? What are those things that are promoting acts of sexual assault or harassment, or what assumptions do we need to put in place so that we can counter and deter such acts? We're really talking about deep change in individuals and deep change in our organizations. And then again, go to the next level and do that audit and think about what are those beliefs and values around here that are maybe manifesting some of this. I made a comment earlier that in my belief in the United States Army, we highly value masculinity. Now, that's not male or female, that's masculinity and toughness, right? Now, we have to challenge some of that and ask ourselves, is that maybe perhaps one of the factors that is perhaps a factor that's generating some of these behaviors? Maybe we need to think about these a little bit more, talk about them, and figure out ways that we can better manifest those into our artifacts. When I was a commander, I commanded a unit called Hard Rock. You're not going to walk around an Army base and see Echo Company, that's the ethereal company or whatever, right? Again, the artifacts are all in line with these deeper things that are below the waterline. So as a leader, this is where we need to understand culture, we need to understand the layers, and if we truly want to make change, we have to drive change below the water. Next slide, please. So I published a paper with a colleague when I was still in the Army a long time ago. One of the things I did, my very last assignment, I was the founding director of the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic, CAPE, which was responsible for looking at these issues of leadership and ethical leadership and values and beliefs across the entire Army as a force. And one of the models that we use is shown on the slide here to get people to think about the differences in the two different approaches to morality. You've got this more obligatory type of morality, the compliance mentality, that's all about rule following. It's the morality of obligation, making sure that people don't go below the moral floor. So you can have a unit that's very focused, or a school or a university, it's very focused on this obligatory compliance, making sure people don't do wrong, that people aren't committing sexual assault and harassment. Well, that's one form of culture. Another form that I would propose is where we get people to reach toward the moral ceiling, that the culture is more about not how can we avoid wrong, but how can we do right. And a lot of that, as you see on the right-hand side of the slide here, is all about creating an identity in people. The obligatory behavior is about what people should do or shall not do. The identity-conferring motivation is, who should I be? Who should we be? What should we aspire to as an organization? What is that moral aspiration that we can attempt to achieve? It's a totally different narrative in the organization. When I was in the Army, I can't tell you how many times I was marched into a auditorium to hear a compliance speech about issues like sexual harassment and sexual assault. And it always just struck me, why aren't we bringing the team together? And instead of having somebody stand in front of us that's the compliance officer in this area, why don't we have our leaders guiding us in a conversation about how negative those behaviors are to the force and to our performance and to our ability to fight? And why aren't we talking about who we really want to be and achieve as a force? If you could click, one of the other areas, if you can click on the slide one time, that I've done a lot of research in is the study of moral emotions. And the reason why these are so critical is because our moral emotions are a primary driver of self-regulation. So when we think about a soldier or a university student that is maybe struggling and having some impulse or desire to commit sexual assault or harassment, it's the manifestation of these moral emotions that self-regulate and keep people in check. And so when we think about creating a culture of obligation, well, what we're trying to do is create fear in people that, hey, if you do this, the hammer's going to come down on you, or to try to guilt or shame or embarrass people into compliance, right? Versus tapping into those uplifted moral emotions, where we're creating sympathy for those around us and understanding, compassion for those around us and their needs, wants, and desires, their safety, their well-being, which is central to this conversation, and creating a sense of pride and what they call moral elevation, that people feel good and positive and prideful that, hey, we are a top unit or a top organization. We don't do that stuff around here, right? We're better than that. And again, it's a complete and totally different narrative that I would encourage. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, the other thing that I'll just quickly talk about before I end is leadership, and a lot of the leadership theories. When you us in the leadership field, there are leadership scholars. There's a lot of different theories out there, but there are a couple of big buckets we tend to kind of put the theories in. Some of them are what we call transactional leadership, and some are transformational leadership. And transactional leadership, as you can see up top, are those types of behaviors where a leader is creating, systems and policies and procedures and directives and all of that. In this case, in the area of sexual assault and harassment, we have monitoring, reporting systems, ways to hold people accountable. Where do we put our resources as far as offices and training and other things for this topic area? Who do we promote? Who do we hire? Who do we fire? Those are some of the strongest signals we can send across an organization of the type of people we want around here. And those send the big shot across the bow when we are making sure we're doing those types of HR decisions where people can see that the people that are successful around here and get to stay on the team are those that support this area. And then transformational leadership is what gets into what I was talking about earlier, the morality of aspiration. If we want to create change in people, if we truly want to get this at the source and not focus on the behaviors of sexual assault and harassment, we've got to change those underlying assumptions that I talked about, which means we have to have deep conversations. We've got to teach our values and operationalize them. Tell people what do they look like in behavior. Leaders, of course, have to be role modeling what we expect. As soon as a leader says something or is dismissive or does anything to denigrate somebody of another gender or whatever, it normalizes that behavior that's okay around here. Leaders create a vision. I talked earlier about aspiration. Who do we want to be in our culture? And how does that link to our cohesion and our ability to operate and perform as a group? There's this issue of superordinate goals. A lot of research shows that you take diverse people, men, women, and other categories, it doesn't matter, any kind of diversity, you put people together toward superordinate goals, it forces them to work together, and they get to learn about each other and each other, what value they bring to the team. You know, I spent a couple of tours in combat, and I always say that combat's the great equalizer. You know, I didn't see these types of issues in combat. You saw them in garrison, because we all had that superordinate goal that we put in front of us that was more important than anything else. And then the last thing I'll just say is this issue of moral disengagement. I don't have time to get into it today, but I would encourage all of you to look at Albert Bandura's work. You can see down at the bottom in the small print there. One of the biggest things that allows these types of behaviors to happen in a culture is when we allow moral disengagement to happen. And the reason why is those moral emotions I talked about earlier don't get kicked in, because we get to justify our behavior. We blame the victim. We dehumanize the victim. I remember at West Point, you know, when the females were first brought into West Point into 1977, people were calling them split tails because their uniforms were split in back, right? Those types of words, they denigrate and they dehumanize people, and it allows people to look at others as less than them, less than human, allows these types of behaviors to happen. Advantageous comparison, well, it's not as bad as somebody else. Diffusion of responsibility, well, everybody else is doing it around here. Or some form of moral justification or euphemisms or whatever. I don't have time to get into all of those, but those are one of the things that leaders have to keep their eye on the ball. And if you see any incidences of moral disengagement, we are setting the conditions for a culture where these types of things can happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm sorry, I know it's kind of a drive-by shooting, but I only had a few minutes, and I look forward to any questions you might have later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hanna. Dr. Magley, if you could talk to us about leveraging civility and dealing with sexual assault, sexual harassment, please take it away.
Quickly. So yes, thank you so much. If I could actually have the next slide, please. Before really getting into how I view civility as a foundation for sexual harassment prevention, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page on how the various forms of mistreatment connect with one another. Beginning with sexual harassment, in 2018, as Liz Hutchinson pointed out in the chat window, the National Academies created another iceberg, talking about the different forms of sexual harassment and their relationship with one another, where the waterline really denotes public consciousness, what is above the waterline public is aware of and thinks of when they hear about sexual harassment, and what's below is not really part of public consciousness around sexual harassment. So the very tip of the iceberg, most readily recognizable in the public consciousness, is sexual coercion, including using professional threats, rewards to obtain sexual favors, those kinds of behaviors. And then also some forms of unwanted sexual attention, which are in the big red triangle, including things like sexual assault, rape, and unwanted groping or stroking. And yes, sexual assault and rape can be part of sexual harassment from a psychological perspective. These are the behaviors that break through to public consciousness and yet widely recognized as impermissible sexual harassment. But there are also behaviors that institutional policies and procedures tend to target. But the research is clear the most common form of sexual harassment is gender harassment, the sexist and sexualized insults that demean, derogate, and humiliate people in gender-related ways. And these are the things that are largely below the waterline, including humiliating acts, offensive sexual teasing or remarks about bodies. And many of you have probably already seen this iceberg figure. But gender harassment is not about romance gone awry. It's not about trying to pull women into sexual relationships. Instead, as another NASM committee member, Lilia Cortina, puts it, it's about pushing women out of careers where they're seen not to fit and not to belong. Next slide, please. In fact, the opposite could be argued to be more true in terms of gender harassment and the effect of gender harassment and gender harassment kind of not being part of public consciousness. Here are findings from a meta-analysis which combined results from 88 studies involving over 70,000 women. The numbers graphed here are effect sizes, which quantify the magnitude of relationship among each subtype of harassing conduct, and then connecting those with 4 different outcomes: physical health, supervisor, coworker, and job satisfaction. So for example, the pink bars show you the size of the relationship between sexual coercion and women's physical health and satisfaction. You see the largest effects with supervisor satisfaction. It goes to the farthest to the right? And the smallest effect with overall job satisfaction. What's striking is that when you compare effect sizes for sexual coercion in pink with effect sizes for gender harassment in yellow, you see that gender harassment has at least as great, if not greater, an impact on professional and personal health compared to unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion. If I could have the next slide, please. And this is really important to point out in terms of the importance of understanding gender harassment. So the strength of these negative effects of gender harassment may arise due to their much greater prevalence. And these are, what I'm showing here in this slide, are data from student surveys at a couple of universities showing that between 20 and 50% of students in science, engineering, and medicine experience sexual harassment from faculty or staff. And across different fields of study, non-STEM, science, engineering, and medicine, note that gender harassment, which can be separated into sexist hostility and crude sexual behaviors as shown by the blue and gray bars, is by far the most frequent type of harassment experienced. Unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion, again, those types of sexual harassment that are central to public awareness, are actually quite infrequent. If I could have the next slide, please. Bar graphs like these, however, don't really convey the fact that these types of sexual harassment occur together. So in this slide, I'm showing you the co-occurrence of the different types of harassment. So these are incidence rates from women, faculty, and staff at a large public university in the Midwest. 37% of female faculty and staff in these data reported no harassment, and this was asked over the period of the past 2 years. And this is the black slice of the pie on the left. That leaves 63% who encountered at least one variant of sexually harassing conduct, more than 6 in 10 in the past 2 years. Most of those experiences involve some kind of gender harassment, represented here in different shades of blue, and co-occurring with different types of experiences. So 34% gender harassment alone, 20% gender harassment and unwanted sexual attention, and then 4% did include sexual coercion as well. But what's important to point out is that sexual coercion almost never occurs in isolation from gender harassment and unwanted sexual attention. As such, we can conceive of gender harassment as the base of sexual harassment in many ways. And when it's tolerated, other forms of sexual harassment are more likely to also occur. As such, it's really critically important to pay attention to and enact policies that cover gender harassment as a way to address the most common form of sexual harassment and to help prevent other types of harassment. May I have the next slide, please? Now let's add in workplace incivility. As Dr. Porath was speaking earlier, it can be defined as low-intensity, deviant, rude, discourteous behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target in violation of workplace norms for mutual respect. Sandy Lim and Lilia Cortina found in a study including both female court employees on the left and female attorneys on the right in this figure here, that gender harassment and workplace incivility empirically factored together and fairly strongly, as shown by the 0.56 and 0.67 factor correlations. Additionally, they found that virtually all gender harassment, that gender harassed women also reported incivility, which suggests that gender harassment takes place against the backdrop of generalized disrespect. And if gender harassment does, then so too do unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion, given this broader overlap of all the different forms of sexual harassment that I just presented in the previous slide. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and I've actually spent my time arguing this afternoon that the constellation of workplace mistreatment experiences, assault, gender harassment, coercion, unwanted sexual attention, incivility, are frequent and actually more similar than dissimilar. The elephant in the room, big question, is what can be done to intervene, or better yet, prevent this constellation of experiences naturally. We know that sexual harassment training has not reduced even sexual harassment as we'd have liked. As such, the EEOC and the national academies have pushed to consider civility interventions as an alternate form of intervention, essentially flipping the incivility, harassment, assault in the top little bubble here, constellation, to become conversations around civility, respect, and support in the center bubble on the left. Such positively valenced effort is thought to really inspire action rather than retreat or cynicism from participants. And we know that civility experiences and interventions have been found to have positive effects on individuals, as well as organizational outcomes in the form of decreased burnout, increased cohesion, decreased incivility, as Dr. Porath noted earlier this afternoon. The research does stop here, though, in that we don't yet know the extent to which civility interventions will affect this broader constellation of mistreatment experiences. Can civility interventions alter sexual harassment, sexual assault? It certainly seems possible that if we flip this narrative to civility, respect, and support, that we can inspire belongingness, psychological safety, as well as well-being, as indicated in the last part of the bubble there. And it also seems certainly possible, particularly when considering that if these forms of mistreatment can escalate in their joined negativity, why wouldn't they be similarly able to de-escalate with the introduction of the positive counter-narrative of civility? And I'll leave you with that, with hope that future research efforts will help shed light on this possibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Magley. And now we have Dr. Levi to help as our discussant, lead a participatory discussion. Dr. Levi, take it away.
Thanks so much, Dr. Nye. I know we're going to run out of time quickly, and I was really appreciating the trajectory of today's conversation, starting with Dr. Gallus's discussion of how core values, processes, and core beliefs have a huge impact on the behaviors that people exhibit. I thought Dr. Hanna did a really masterful job of connecting that to leadership and how leadership has to reflect those core values and beliefs. And I, of course, couldn't help thinking about the contrast between the military and the academic area that so many of us are working in, and how we don't have those leadership values ingrained in us, and how that has an impact on the kind of culture and environment that we create. And Dr. Magley's observations about civility and the impact that civility can have on creating belongingness and a sense of safety for everybody in the environment. I know I don't have a lot of time to ask the questions of our panelists. I'll try to have one quickie for each of you. I wanted to know, in the context of how one could create a sense of belonging and validation, Dr. Gallus, if you have any suggestions about what kinds of activities can reinforce that from the grassroots level. I think Dr. Hanna spoke really eloquently to how that happens at the leadership level, but how do we do it among our constituents?
Thanks for that question, Amy. And I don't want to throw it back to Dr. Hanna because I feel like that's a total cop-out, but as a military leader, I'm sure he has his own perspective on this. I think there are a few different ways. I think part of it is setting the conditions for folks to be able to bring their true selves to work, for folks to be able to be authentic, to be able to make a mistake and it not be the end of the world, to be able to raise concerns. You know, when someone raises a concern and immediately that person is shot down or dismissed, it creates this environment where people really feel like they cannot come forward. And then the other piece I've heard from many military leaders is through shared hardship as a way to really increase belongingness, connection. So going through some experiences that are tough, even if you're civilians, a lot of times we get these taskers that we've got an hour to get this back to, somebody very senior, we've got something to do. Even things like that, I think, can create cohesion, which is really critical. So I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thanks. Dr. Hannah, can you speak to that sense of how do we do that from the top down as well as from the bottom up?
So I've done a little bit of research on belongingness. One thing that's really interesting to me is there's the felt belongingness of the organizational member, but there's also the sense of the leader and others in the team. Does this person belong? Right? You're never going to make somebody feel that they have belongingness unless other people have a mental mindset that that person does belong. Otherwise, it'll come out in their verbal and nonverbal behavior to make that person feel like they won't. And in this particular topic here, I think, of sexual assault and harassment, really we're talking largely about the perpetrator, right? It is more about the person that should feel that other people belong. But yeah, research does show that, you know, having those shared superordinate goals that Dr. Gallus just talked about, those shared hard experiences brings teams together. You know, so does that environment of psychological safety she talked about, where people have freedom to fail, freedom to be authentic and not be ridiculed. Issues of trust in an organization, that people know that other people, for example, are benevolent toward them, that they're truly looking out for their best interests and not looking to stab them in the back. And I mean, I can go on and on. I know we're kind of out of time here, but there's a lot of those factors. Again, this just all goes back to good leadership. And if you do it right, you're going to prevent a lot of things from happening in organizations you don't want to see happen, and you'll create an organization of moral aspiration. That's the message that I think needs to be more hammered home.
Yeah, thank you for that. I am going to give Dr. Magley the last word, particularly because the chat, it was mentioned in the chat that how do you create civility in a way that's sincere and genuine? And of course, the tone at the top, that's really what it's all about in terms of leadership, but I'll have you bring it home with that last comment that came from the chat.
I absolutely would agree. I think that that the tone at the top is so crucial. And if there is one thing that we need, and we being all kinds of organizations and institutions, right? We need to train our leaders better, right? As people are moving into leadership positions, in my personal opinion, there ought to be mandatory requirements that they've already demonstrated leadership excellence before they can even apply to those higher level positions. The idea that we put people into leadership positions and expect them to be able to perform as leaders without providing them beforehand with a lot of that training is, I think, scary and dangerous for the success and well-being of our people. And so the leadership piece, I think, is so crucial. And the leaders can do simple things too sometimes about creating tones of respect and belonging and civility. You know, this idea that you make eye contact in the hallway as you're walking through and checking on your people, right? That doesn't always happen, right? And that it's so ridiculous that can't just be kind of and eye contact is a way to do that. I could blather on forever, but leadership, yes.
I think we all could, and I know we're out of time. And I just want to thank everybody for their participation. Great comments in the chat. I want to take a minute to look at them after we log off. And thank you to Dr. Gallus and her colleagues for bringing us together on this incredibly important topic. So thanks to everybody for your participation today.
Thank you, Dr. Levi, Dr. Nye, Dr. Gallus, Dr. Magley, and Dr. Hannah for another incredible session. I am going to ask everyone who is tuned in here on Zoom or YouTube or Divids to take a leadership action. If you have colleagues who you believe should be engaged in this work, have them register for the conference. They can join for further sessions. They can access other sessions on recording. This is going to take a village. It's going to take the entire Department of Defense and all of higher education. And of course, with the support of the Department of the Navy, registration is free. So feel free. I just put the link into the chat. Feel free to share it with colleagues. We welcome more and more to join us on this important work. Thank you to our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Morgan Clifford before we take our 15-minute break to give the all-important code. Morgan.